Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. Today we have a special show and a special guest, and we're delighted to welcome political comedian, podcast host of Supreme himself, Matt Forde, to the show.
Hello.
And we're going to have welcome, Matt. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to have a good chat about political comedy, fast-changing events, how you create a new show in 3 weeks because the Prime Minister has ruined your plans and called an early election in the summer, 3 weeks before the Edinburgh Festival begins, which I assume means that you had to rewrite the show you're bringing to Edinburgh this year pretty quickly.
Yes, but it's often the case. So I'm kind of used to stuff happening at this time of year. And I think, in a way, I've made my peace with it. I enjoy the challenge of a big thing happening and then having to create something around it. I find it easier, really, than when times are more settled. So I was actually delighted when he called it for various reasons.
Yeah, well, because I suppose we should say that you used to work for the Labour Party and then realised that being a professional comedian rather than a poorly paid, low-level operative in a comedic organisation was a more fruitful line of work. I mean, tell us, how did you make this transition and how long did it take, if you like?
You make me sound like a mercenary. I worked for the Labour Party when it was socially acceptable, when Tony Blair was leader and when Gordon Brown was leader. And I was then I'd moved down to London, then I got a job in public affairs, and it was getting harder to work for Labour around that time in the run-up, in between 2005 and 2010, because the party's resources were cut to the bone. And what was once a very rewarding job was becoming very, very difficult to carry out. I then worked as an advisor in local government in Stoke for the elected mayor, the first elected mayor in England. In fact, Stoke is the only city in England to have had an elected mayor, it was the first, then have another referendum 6 years later to abolish the post. And that was while I was working for him. So I was coming to the conclusion that maybe I wasn't very good at it, as well as the fact that it was very stressful. I'd always done comedy on the side. I did my first gig when I was 16, so it was always something that I was following at the same time as I was doing politics, but it was quite hard because politics just demands so much of your time. And then once I moved to London, I started doing a bit more stuff, and then got a show on Talk Sport. I did the overnight slot on Talk Sport 3 nights a week, and that allowed me to jack in the day job and gig the rest of the week, and that's when things really started to take off.
Matt, with people who make their living partly doing political impressions, I mean, a change of government brings challenges. I mean, the late, great Mike Yarwood probably privately despaired that Mrs. Thatcher won in 1979 because Janet Brown had to then be parachuted in to all of his shows. It does strike me that for the current government, there's quite a rich vein here for impressionists because Starmer has a very boring voice, but a very distinct voice. Rachel Reeves has a very distinct voice. Angela Rayner has a very distinct voice. Is this an impressionist's paradise, the new government?
It is, absolutely. And the key thing is to try and get ahead of the curve. So the moment Keir Starmer became Labour leader, I started working on an impression because I think it's just good to be able to do the key players anyway. And it sort of feels like I'm the only one doing him, which is great. I'm not aware of anyone else impersonating Keir Starmer at the moment. So I had him and Sunak. You're right. I mean, Rayner, with Starmer, he's kind of got that. A lot of Labour people have this. Ed Miliband had it. That sort of blocked adenoidal sound burden. And obviously Keir is his own version of that. There's still a blockage there, and there's a very tight jaw, and particularly there's a certain way that he's got this blocked nose sound, and then but almost like a metronomic noise that comes from the front of his mouth. The fundamentals of global economic competition. There's like a real. It's almost like he speaks in music, so he's good. Angela Rayner, she's great fun. Trying to figure out this sort of ways like Liam Gallagher, like we're going to build houses, you fucking live in them. That's how it works, mate. She's great. Rachel Reeves, I haven't quite got yet, but she has a bit of that, almost Janet Street Portery. Yeah, you can almost hear, which I haven't quite nailed down, but there's almost that sort of Miliband era blockage with a slightly more London twang to hers. So yes, it is good to have fresh new and regional accents in there, which always helps.
Tell me, what do they say privately? Because a lot of politicians will say it's it's the ultimate form of flattery to be taken off. But of course, I mean, it's not. I mean, the original spitting image, and David Steele's quite open about this, killed his reputation because he was always in David Owen's pocket, and it really said that he was the sort of junior alliance partner and all of that. And John Major was always portrayed as the grey man. The sketches were in monochrome, and the only thing in colour was the green peas on the plate when he asked Norma for more green peas. So it actually has the capacity to really severely dent reputations. Are you aware of this when you're doing it, and what kind of feedback do you get from politicians?
I think, on the whole, most people, and I think this goes for most people that you impersonate, they never, I think it freaks them out a little bit. I think they feel like you've figured them out on some level. That in noticing their verbal and facial movements, that somehow you're inside their mind in a way that you in a way that Native American tribes wouldn't have their photo taken. It's in a way that they feel like you've captured part of their soul. And Blair always, I remember him saying that I never thought, by the way, that your impersonation of me was, particularly accurate, but my kids came to see it and said, "Dad, it really," you feel like, because part of your personality is obviously expressed through your movement, isn't it? So Keir Starmer, I know, doesn't think it's very good. In fact, I met with him at the last Edinburgh Festival for a pint after one of the shows, and he said, "Oh, how was it?" I said, "Oh yeah." He said, "You still doing the Keir Starmer impression?" I went, yeah. And there was a bit I had about, if you wanted to get a Keir Starmer impression, the way to do it was to master the phrase, "the Metropolitan Police," because that was, the phrase he was using all the time, and it really sounded like him. So he will periodically do an impression of my impression back to me and go, "Oh, how was the gig?" I'll go, "Right." "The Metropolitan Police," in a sort of cartoony. It's become a very meta experience now. He does an impression of my impression, but I think they always find the bit that doesn't sound it. They say, "Oh, well, you do me a bit too squeaky or a bit too high-pitched or whatever." Whereas obviously they're caricatures. You're trying to get as close as possible, but you have to dial up certain elements. And I think that's where perhaps you're defining something, is that if you make them sound sillier or thicker or maybe nastier than they really are, then there's an editorial element to it that I think sometimes that they can be a little bit resistant to. But no one has ever taken serious offence, as far as I'm aware.
At least not yet. But but I mean, if you look back over the last sort of decade of Scottish and British politics and so on, this has been a target-rich environment for political satirists and humorists of all sorts, even for newspaper columnists. Frankly, there has been an abundance of material, whether that's from the independence referendum in 2014, Brexit, obviously, COVID, Boris, Truss. Trump over in the United States. Are you not a little concerned that Keir Starmer's promise to tread a little more lightly on people's lives and make politics boring again is going to be bad for trade?
Not at all. I think change is always good for trade. I think... and I don't really think, my first thing, without sounding like terribly pompous about it, I'm just relieved to have a more mature government. That's my overriding feeling, is I'd rather things be run well. So I think that's my main feeling about it. And then when I think about my work or like the effect on the industry, I think it's brilliant. I think having a new cast of characters to take the mick out of. And the thing is, the idea that Angela Rayner is going to be boring, I do not accept. The idea that, and I realise that we're getting more into policy than personality, but the idea that reforming planning law so that England is now going to be covered in onshore wind farms, nuclear reactors, and tons more housing estates is just going to not upset anyone. There are huge battles ahead that will be really good for comedy, because you've got a group of people taking different political decisions, and they therefore will have different victories and defeats. They're still human beings. They're going to make mistakes. Jealousies and rivalries will come to the fore. There will be new people that are incompetent and daft and say silly things. The stuff of politics that makes it so great to cover, whether it's political analysis, podcasts, or comedy, will always be there. So it's just, I think it's cool to just have a new set of people to take the piss out of.
Matt, if we spin your timeline back a bit when you were a young lad, what came first in terms of an interest to you? Was it politics, the political system, getting involved, getting active, or did the politics lead to the comedy, or did the comedy lead you to politics? Which way was it?
They were two completely separate hobbies, really. And I was never one of those people that had, young people that you meet in politics sometimes are just desperate to be an MP and they'll have 5-year plans and they're very networky. I got involved really in the same way that I got involved in supporting a football team. Was I just thought from a young age, I realised politics was very important. I remember Thatcher going, so I must have been 9. Oh, sorry, no, maybe 7 the day that she went, and then Major winning in 92, I'd have been 9, and then Blair winning in 97, I was 14. So I was becoming obsessed really even before my 10th birthday, just realising that it was big and important and that it could have an effect on people's lives. And then comedy I was doing almost just a separate pursuit. When I first started doing comedy, it wasn't about politics at all. It was, when I was 16, it was gibberish, it was just about the sort of stuff 16-year-old boys talk about. There was no politics in there at all. So then it was only a bit later, once I'd stopped working in politics, a couple of mates said to me, "You've got this amazing experience, and you never talk about it on stage. You never talk about political stuff." So I was quite late to realising that actually that was something that I probably should have merged. So they were just two completely separate interests, and I would they're to me the same as football. Is that they're just things that I really love watching and being at, and I guess the difference is I wasn't good enough to be a footballer. I'm not saying that I'm great at politics or comedy, but they are things that I got involved in and ended up working in.
Well, I propose something completely different. I was going to say, do you actually remember Nottingham Forest winning the European Cup?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, that Nottingham Forest and the Labour Party trading on past glories for decades.
Sadly, I wasn't alive when we won the European Cup. I was born in 82.
Oh, God.
I know. It's so gutting.
Tragic.
I'm out of here.
2 stars. Forest crests. But I remember Brian Clough being manager and still a relative level of glory, going to Wembley a lot when we were young. And then obviously, as Alex says, we were not good for a very long time.
And Clough was probably the most impersonated football manager back in the day, because he, again, had such a distinct voice. Probably Clough and Shankly. But I digress.
Well, everyone did a Clough impression. You meet, and I've been very lucky to meet a lot of the players of that generation, people like John McGovern and John Robertson, Colin Barrett, people who still, Frank Clark. They meet up every Thursday in Nottingham. It's called the Thursday Club. And it's a collection of mainly that generation, Gary Birtles and a few others. And then just anyone who's played for Forest can nip along for a pint. And I've been lucky to go along a few times. And everyone, John McGovern does a great Clough. And everyone's got a different young man. They're all quite... they all have all perfected a Clough impression for their after-dinner speeches. He still lives on through their stories.
The best player I've ever heard impersonating Clough was Kevin Keegan. He does a marvellous Brian Clough.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. Anyway, we are digressing, Alex.
We are terribly. Let's get back to Edinburgh. We must shamelessly and ruthlessly and determinedly plug your show. It's called End of an Era, which is itself a shameless rip-off. There, people on YouTube can see a splendid depiction of Matt dressed in some sort of, I don't know, male Taylor Swift outfit or something. And it's playing at the Pleasance, which is your residence in Edinburgh every year, isn't it? What's it all going to be about?
Well, my big plan was obviously that there was going to be an election later this year. And then the show was a look ahead to big elections in Britain and America, and that we were going to lead up to the end of an era. Obviously, that's all sort of happened already. So, although it still works, it's there is a bit in it about the end of the Tory party, but really, it's, I guess, in a way, it's about the start of an era. It's about the new government and taking the mick out of them. So, someone else came up with it. I'm terrible at coming up with show titles. I've run out of puns, and someone at Avalon, who are my management company, said, "Oh, why don't you do, instead of Eras tour, do End of an Era, and you can dress up like Taylor Swift?" I just thought, well, that's who would say no to that?
And obviously, your appearance at Edinburgh, and then subsequently, I assume you're touring nationwide and so on, will have a similar impact on GDP and productivity as Swift's residences at Murrayfield, Wembley, Anfield.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I'm not sure it will generate $1 billion. Not American
surely you could
dollars,
sell this. Surely you could fill the City Ground.
Oh my God! That would obviously be a dream. I think it would. I mean, boxers, I think, in the past have struggled to convince the City Ground to allow them to host fights. Take That played it recently, so I mean, I back myself, but I don't think I don't think my ego stretches to thinking I could sell 30,000 tickets in a night.
How do you go about writing a show, Matt? Do you start with a narrative in your head? Do you start with a number of stories, a number of gags, a number of impersonations? How do you go about putting the building blocks of a show together?
It's always a mixture. I always think I've got to have impressions in there because I do them. So I think I'm definitely doing Starmer and Sunak and Trump and some of the others that I chuck in. And then, in a way, it's like just an extension of my opinions on things. So why do I think the Tories lost the election? Why do I think Labour won it? What are Labour going to do, and why is that funny? So just, in a way, then narratives emerge out of routines that start from that. And also, I just watch a lot of it. So it's a mixture. Some I will start like that. I'll think, right, Labour have got a different plan to the one the Tories had. So all this stuff about planning, I think, is really interesting. Is there anything funny in that? And then there's other stuff where I would just watch them a lot, and funny ideas would just come to me as I'm watching Sunak or Starmer or Rayner or whoever. And then I just sort of incorporate them. And then the more I rehearse the material at preview shows, the more other themes kind of emerge. So, about populism. And then you can group stuff about Farage and Lee Anderson, there's always a sort of natural flow around, because obviously a lot of these things are in common. Every party has its extremists, every party has its idiots, and so there's always a kind of loose structure that I will go from party to party, but I prefer to have other themes in there as well. And obviously one thing that came out of the election is just how politics is just, as well as delivering a huge Labour landslide, remarkable, really, given the share of the vote. There's also just that splintering that I think people are slightly worried about. Also, I think the Greens don't get it enough. Everyone's talking about reform and stuff like that. The Greens are a political party. They've got some very undesirable people in them, and I think it's quite fun to set the piss out of the Greens, because everyone thinks, oh, they're nice people. They must be a lot nicer than us because they care about the trees. And anyone who's covered the Scottish Greens will know that they're not necessarily better than the rest of us.
Yeah, well, they certainly tend to think so. There's the Green MP in Norfolk and so on who says, well, yes, of course, they're all for renewable power, but we're not going to have any. I'm opposed to any pylons coming through my constituency to deliver power from offshore wind to where it's going to be needed, which is the sort of thing that I suspect political comedians enjoy pointing out and referring to.
And he's the co-leader of the Greens, that bloke.
Yeah, well, maybe they should probably stick to things like banning greyhound racing.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you play all over the UK, but obviously, is there a difference between when you're doing a show in Scotland, say, and a show south of the border or in Wales? I mean, I guess when you're, I've seen you in Scotland, you don't spend a lot of time on Plaid Cymru when you're playing in Scotland, and I assume you don't do a huge amount on the SNP when you're playing in Dorset or something like that. But do audiences react differently in different parts of the UK because you obviously have to do a bit of sort of local stuff at times as well?
Oh, yes. So in Scotland, I'll always do more on the SNP than I would in England. The main thing with the SNP was that a lot of people, I guess, out of Scotland just weren't that bothered. And certainly a lot of people that would go to maybe comedy shows probably thought Nicola Sturgeon was all right. So actually, in a way, convincing people that the SNP were incompetent and corrupt was harder outside of Scotland at times, because they just had a sort of general view that, they seem to just be doing things a little bit better, when obviously the reality was anything but. So I would always do more SNP stuff in Scotland, and obviously that felt really illicit. I mean, I've never felt more English than when I do material about the SNP in Scotland, because you're just so aware that you're an outsider. I always felt that I was sort of that I had to not buy credibility, but it makes sense when the Tories are in government. You start with the Tories, you give the government a good bashing first. But always start with the government. So it's Labour now, and then the opposition, and then you've kind of earned the right. Because one thing you do notice, particularly I think at the Edinburgh Festival, where you've got people from all over coming, is that at different times they're sensitive about different things, or small amounts of people within that audience are. So around 2014, independent supporters were definitely the most sensitive caucus. You know, people would walk out. They couldn't believe that you were taking the mick out of it when it was so obviously a good thing. Then it was the Corbyn supporters. They couldn't, I remember one guy walking out, and it was the Pleasance Fourth. So people have to walk. They have to walk down to the stage to get out of the venue. So they have to walk past you as you're on. And he had like a grey beard, even looked like Corbyn. And he just said, "I can't hear you talk about Jeremy like this." In this really almost spiritual way. And then in recent years, with everything that happened with Sturgeon, it's SNP supporters that are a bit more sensitive again. Now, obviously, the vast majority of people are fine and can hear jokes about parties they vote for without taking it personally. But at different stages in the political cycle, depending on who is either up or down, their supporters are always a little bit more sensitive. That said, I have to say, I've never had a problem with the Tories.
Well, the Tories,
they don't care.
The Tories, they understand why people hate them, and they think it's perfectly reasonable, because there's a part of the Tory party that hates the Tory party. I remember seeing you play at a gig at the Stand in Edinburgh, and you'd done sort of 40 minutes ripping into the Tories, Farage, lot on Labour, and so on. And then you'd got 30 seconds into, this was after the interval or something. You'd got 30 seconds into doing a couple of mild jokes about the SNP, and this guy right at the front stood up and he just shouted, "I'm Scottish, you're an arsehole," and walked out. Absolutely tremendous.
I didn't disagree with either fact. He was Scottish and I am an arsehole, so he had a point. But yeah, he couldn't. Do you know what? I was aware of him, because at the Stand in Edinburgh, when you're on stage, the audience is very, very close to you. It's a tiny stage. And I could see him the whole time. I think he brought his girlfriend along, and the first half, he was loving it, and I could see him sort of nudging her and stuff. The moment I was doing stuff about the ferry scandal, he just couldn't believe it. He was like, "What? This isn't part of the deal. No. We're good people. This can't be true." Just couldn't handle it. And I always make sure that the routines that I'm doing about stuff like that are factually accurate. And I'm never, I don't think, gratuitous or nasty. I'm always teasing in the right way and pointing out things that are factual. He didn't really have a leg to stand on, but just couldn't handle criticism at all about the party that he supported, giving a supporter, an independent supporter, hundreds of millions of pounds wasted on these ferries. It was just, I don't understand why he wasn't as outraged as I was. I'd be livid if a party that I was so invested in would have done something like that. But I don't think, maybe that's not how tribalism works.
I mean, is there a difference in audiences reacting to you in the big cities as opposed to the larger towns? And is there a different dynamic in an audience if you're playing in Scotland? I mean, it used to be said years ago that the Glasgow Pavilion was the graveyard of English comedians. I recall the story of Mike and Bernie Winters, who did the Glasgow Empire, and one of them was on the stage and the other one poked his head round the curtain, and the cry went up, "Oh fuck, there's a second one." Scottish audiences, Glasgow audiences in particular, at the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, there was the Diary of Anne Frank that was playing, and it was a particularly boring production. And when the Gestapo came onto the stage, the cry went up, "She's in the attic." So Glasgow audiences have a tendency to participate, even when they're not asked. I mean, I saw the Jonathan Pye show recently at the Pavilion Theatre. I was exhausted watching him. I was utterly exhausted. He is a complete and utter force of nature. But of course, a lot of these marvelous monologues were brilliant. But some people who were devotees were actually joining in. And at 2 points in the performance, he had to say, "I really need silence from the audience," because it clearly cuts across the sort of just the mental nature of having to get this sort of stuff out. So are there audiences which, if you like, overstep the mark?
I think that you do notice a difference in some places. I mean, Scottish audiences are always very, very good. And I think there is...
That's a very sensible thing to say on a podcast that's based on Scottish politics.
A very cynical, targeted message to a Scottish podcast. But they are. Edinburgh's always great. Glasgow, similarly. I mean, they're the two... I'm doing Aberdeen on this tour, which I've never performed before, which I'm excited about. I think...
Good luck.
Good luck. You better master a bit of the Doric.
People in Aberdeen haven't paid good money to laugh, I
think the main thing that I notice is sometimes it's energy levels. Like in cities, I think London's completely different. London is its own system, really, because people who've come to see you if you do a theatre in London could have gone to see The Lion King. So there's less of a sense that this is a novelty in London, I think. There's slightly harder audiences at times. Whereas in other cities, you get that feel that you're in a big place and that there's a buzz in the air and stuff like that. And the difference sometimes is that in slightly smaller places, if you've managed to find a venue somewhere, and I don't, whoever it is who books my tours, they figure this stuff out. But sometimes you go somewhere where they don't get much at all, the atmosphere is insane. They are just so grateful that someone has showed up to put on something that they are. It's a completely different atmosphere. It's like a carnival. It sort of goes beyond comedy. They're just so happy that they had to get a babysitter and that someone's come to their place to put something on. Whereas obviously in cities, people are more used to going to see stuff. So that's the main difference I think I find is that. In cities, you get definitely a sort of... you still get a great atmosphere, but people are used to go and see stuff. In slightly smaller places, there is more of a novelty about it. There's more, I guess, in a way, people just afterwards are like, "Oh, we're so happy, we're so surprised that you came here," that they can't believe that anyone would ever want to go there and put on a show. So that's always a nice thing to do.
So you've played Clacton.
You know what? I'm not sure I've played... I was trying to think if I had. I think we went near there when Al Murray stood in Thanet. And he did a Dave documentary where I played his fictional election agent. And I think we might have done a little bit in Clacton. It's actually a beautiful place, Clacton. And this is the shame with politics, is that if there's a politician there that not many people like, it can destroy the reputation of an area. And in Thanet, when we were filming this documentary, we were filming it with real people. There were estate agents in Thanet petrified that Farage, even the fact that Farage had announced he was standing there, had basically, it led to a pause in the housing market because people were going, "I don't want to buy there if he's going to be the MP, I'm not moving there." And it had
that's the metropolitan. Yeah, the metropolitan liberal elite wouldn't move to Thanet with a ruinous effect on house prices. You talk about this as end of an era tour and so on. I mean, you are Is it fair to say that your politics is quite sort of centrist? I mean, of the left, but very much not of the hard left and so on. And so, online, particularly on social media and so on, the far right and the far left are united by their hatred of what they would see as mushy, principle-free centrism. Do you think there is actually anything in that critique, and does it apply to your brand of comedy at all?
No, I don't think there is. I think my values are as deeply held as theirs, and my values are very strong. I think the state has a role to play in enabling people to live their lives, and that is not just in terms of not overtaxing them too much, but ensuring that we have world-class education and healthcare that supports our society. These are the idea that just because you don't want either the market to run free or the state to run everything, that somehow you believe less in that principle, that you want to live in a mixed economy and you think that there should be checks and balances on state and private power. And also, it ignores the fact that that's where most people are. The vast majority of people are there, and they're there for a reason, is that life experience teaches you that it's undesirable to have too much power in the hands of the state, or too much, not enough power at times, a lack of regulation in some areas. So my views are very deeply held, and I would never describe my comedy as mushy. I'd maybe describe it as cheeky and sometimes a bit rude, but I don't think I've ever been described as mushy at all.
Matt, right at the beginning of this podcast, you said that to a certain extent you were cheered that the issue of competence has come back to government. So let me ask you what, first of all, your hopes are for the Starmer administration. You will have observed the New Labour years, and my view of them is that a lot of good that was done by that government was completely and utterly buried with the brouhaha around Blair's management of the war in Iraq. And after that point, he almost became a non-person politically, to the extent that nobody could look objectively on 13 years of Labour government. Then we had the sort of lurch to the left and the historical mistakes of the past, particularly 1983, and putting before people a manifesto which is arguably undeliverable and wasn't supported by the public. Starmer manages to bend that. It does appear to me, in a sort of historical sense, Starmer is very much his own man. He is not a Blairite in a classic New Labour mould. And indeed, in terms of background, and we've, I think, quite a working class cabinet, and arguably he is the most working class Labour leader that we've ever had. Probably the historical analogy is more with Harold Wilson, who had I think, a feel for where the country was. Although it doesn't appear to me that Starmer has a lot of ideological anchors, but he's someone who is very, very practical and indeed will intervene and support interventionist policies to enable and when they're in the public interest. Now, they've got a horrifically difficult job given where all the sort of fiscal position is. So what are your hopes for them? And is he the right man to take the country forward?
Well, to take that bit first, I think he is. And I think people can see that he's already grown into it. He looks completely different now that he's Prime Minister to how he was when he was campaigning in that election. And I think running things suits him. He'd obviously run a public service before. That's where his strengths lie, in problem solving and leading from the top in that pragmatic and practical way that you describe. I think people find that really reassuring after all the years that we've had. And the only reason... you mention it, really, what Labour had done in opposition. The only reason why Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, why Liz Truss was allowed to take over, why all that mess happened, was because the Labour Party was a basket case. If the Labour Party had always chosen the best person to lead it, Boris Johnson would never have been Prime Minister. So when Labour is sensible, it appeals to the country on a grand scale. Now, I know it was only 35% of the vote, but still, I think you can only vote tactically. And Tory voters can only stay at home in those numbers if actually on some level they don't feel that this man is a threat to the state and that this government isn't one that, this is a Labour government that people really feel that they can live under across the UK. My hopes for them, and they've already been borne out, I think, is that they will be the party of sound economic management. And that's not just oh yes, I like to run the economy well for, to appear like a good man. This is about people's lives. And when people talk about sound economic management, that is ensuring that people don't have their homes repossessed, that they're not evicted, that the constant spiral of prices that people have been clobbered by doesn't ruin their lives. I mean, I think sometimes when we talk about the economy, we forget that really what we're talking about is society. This is the things people can't do with their lives. People's economic situation is so perilous that if their grocery shop going up means that not only can they not have a holiday, if the fridge breaks or if the boiler goes, that's it. They're having to make terrible choices with their lives because morons were running the country. And I really hope that particularly Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, I mean, firstly, they absolutely understand that. They're sensible people, motivated by very strong progressive values, realise that running the economy well means that people's lives are better, that people can do more things with their lives. I think on education, they've been really interesting. And I think class has played a huge part in shaping their view on education. And Bridget Phillipson, this whole idea of oracy, however it's pronounced, I think is one of the most perceptive things I've ever heard a politician say, is that for working class kids, it's not just about schools being exam factories and getting people good grades, although that is very, very important, and that the focus on that should never be dimmed. It is also about teaching kids who go to state school the sorts of things that people pick up at private school, which is how to advocate for yourself, having that self-confidence, alleviating that doubt. And I think that is a product not just of Starmer and Bridget Phillipson's class, but also of their own personal experience, that they at times will have felt that the country is run by people who are very good at backing themselves, but actually don't actually know always what they're talking about and don't always have the right answers. So I think on education, on planning, I really agree with them, is that in the end, politics crippled the Tory party. Hey, the way that they handled HS2 still drives me mad. But we will now spend, all that money is sunk into it. We're still going to get trains running on that track, and it's not going to be as good as it really should have been because they were too busy trying to lay a track for Starmer. So I think on things like infrastructure, planning, all this will create jobs, onshore wind, nuclear power, housing developments. The political risk is obviously that the people who have their housing developments built near them, wherever they live, are going to be annoyed, and it's going to be a lot of pressure on those Labour MPs.
They're called Conservatives, Matt. They're called Conservatives.
Exactly. They'll grow the economy, they'll create jobs, they'll improve schools and the health service. And I think, if you can get to 5 years' time and really say we've made huge progress in those areas, then they'll have done very well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the optimistic case for them, certainly, and the positive case for them. I mean, I'm just wondering the role of comedy in the political sort of ecosphere or ecosystem. You think of, what's the most high-profile political or current affairs comedy zone? It's probably still Have I Got News for You, which has been running for decades now, it seems. And if you look at that has it's predicated on the assumption that everyone in public life is a sort of liar, a cheat, a fraud, a know-nothing, an idiot. And, in fairness, plenty of people in public life have done their best to substantiate that general analysis or worldview in recent years. But I wonder, do you think there is a danger that comedy and political comedy in this sense can contribute to a sort of corrosive cynicism about public life and politics more generally, the sense that none of it really matters, they're all frauds and charlatans, and nothing can be trusted, and then you end up being the I'm just asking questions kind of guy. Does it, where do you draw the line then? What's the sort of appropriate balance in terms of because you make a case for politics actually in a lot of your shows as being something that can do good, but a lot of political humour and indeed current affairs coverage in this country is sort of predicated, I think, again, as I say, on this notion that they're all rogues and rascals and nothing useful, nothing good can ever happen.
That drives me mad. I just think it's easier. It's just easier, isn't it, to go, aren't they all shit, and get a cheer? Mm-hmm. Whereas actually harder to be involved in something and to really know the details and realise that actually, I still believe this, the vast majority of people in politics of all parties, mainstream parties, really just want to improve their community and their country. That's really where most of them start from, even if they're coming from ideological roots. It's because they think that idea will alleviate the problems as they see it. And my frustration when people say they're all the same is often the people who say that really don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it's such an ignorant thing to say that they should be laughed at and not in the way that they would like to be, because it's demonstrable that Keir Starmer is very different to Boris Johnson. It's clear that Liz Truss is very different to Rachel Reeves. It's obvious that Anna Sarwar is very different to Nicola Sturgeon. Like these differences are clear, obvious, and visible. And anyone who says they're all the same just hasn't done their homework. It's lazy writing. And the danger, I think, with all performance, particularly with comedy, is the danger is instead of challenging an audience, you tell them what they want to hear because you want to be liked. You're a performer and you want to be liked. And I think that's the root of some of it. It's a mixture of not really knowing what you're talking about and just wanting to be liked and playing to it. And I think I do worry about that, because I think it's not just comedy either. It's any sort of commentary, anything that sort of bleeds into the public consciousness. If you're hearing from every angle, well, these people are rubbish, they're all corrupt, they're all liars, they're all incompetent, really, unless you are completely involved yourself, obviously you have a responsibility to think for yourself as a citizen as well. But if every sphere in which you dip into is telling you this, then I think that's massively corrosive. And I just think it's ignorant. It drives me mad.
Is satire as biting as it used to be? I mean, if we were sort of looking at the sort of historical sweep of comedy programs when there was almost a sense where you could say, when that happened, the sort of influence of comedy and satire became more profound. That was the week that appears to me to be the real tipping point, because the sort of deference of the post-war era and the deference to prime ministers was absolutely killed at that point, and probably that was the week that mercilessly lampooned Alec Douglas Hume. It lampooned Harold Wilson as well. People sometimes forget that. They simply associate it with an attack on the Conservatives and the Grousemoor image and all the rest of it. But it does strike me that from then on, comedy, political comedy, satire, fundamentally changed, deference died. But for its time, if you go back and look at them, it's astonishing in a sense they got away with it. So it begs a very obvious question. Is satire as biting now as it was in 1962 and 1963, Matt?
I think it is. It's just not on telly. I think you went to see Jonathan Pye the other day. That is not a man who holds back. I get on stage and say whatever I like about all these politicians, and particularly with Corbyn. I couldn't have said the things that I said about him on telly. Maybe I don't know.
Not even after the watershed.
Not even after the watershed, and some of the stuff I said about the SNP. Live you can really go for it. I think the problem with satire on telly is that commissioners are slightly wary of it. There's a reason why Have I Got News for You is the only satirical show left. It's established. In a way, it's too big to cancel, and it's part of the furniture. I think making satire on telly now is just so much harder because there are too many people that are scared of losing their jobs. There are too many people, and it's a mixture of, I think, not wanting to piss off the government of the day, and also the effect of social media is that people have been cowed by a pincer movement of effectively online cancel culture and just a wariness that, oh my God, the last thing we want is any trouble. We're not gonna make a show like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, of course,
Matt, it's been an absolute.
Oh yeah. Sorry, no, after you, Bernard. Yeah.
An absolute delight listening to you. A delight to listen to your humour. A delight to listen to your observations. You're not only a comedian, but a serious thinker as well. And best of luck with the shows in Edinburgh. And I'll make sure that I'll be coming along for one of them.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. I love the podcast. It's brilliant. I'm so glad that you're both doing it. You have always been great people to follow, either in print or in broadcast or wherever. This is long overdue. It's brilliant.
Well, you're the first guest to have said that, Matt. So you are automatically now the best guest that we've had on the show. Without a doubt. All the others have had useful things to say, but none of them have been quite as perceptive as you. So yeah, I mean, I think we might have to get you back again another time. Thank you so much. A reminder to those of you listening or watching on the YouTube or Facebook channels that you can get in touch with us, ponsonbymassie@gmail.com or ponsonbymassie at Twitter. And you can also see Matt Forde performing the End of the Era show at the Pleasance Theatre in Edinburgh for pretty much the whole of August. And it'll be a tremendous show. And good luck with it, Matt, and thank you very much for joining us. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.